January 1945. The war in Europe was approaching its final, most violent phase. Allied armies had pushed through France and were pressing toward the German border, but the advance was fragile. In the Alsace region, winter had turned the battlefield into a frozen trap. Snow covered the ground, the earth was locked solid by ice, and the temperature hovered below zero. Men did not just fight the enemy here, they fought the cold, exhaustion, and the slow erosion of their bodies. Near the town of Colmar, the Germans still held a dangerous pocket of resistance. It was a wedge driven into the Allied line, positioned close enough to threaten a devastating counterattack. If that pocket broke through, entire American battalions could be cut off and destroyed before help arrived. German commanders knew this was their last real chance in the West, and they committed everything they had left. Before dawn on January 24th, the attack began. Hundreds of German infantry moved forward in organized waves, supported by Tiger tanks and self-propelled guns. The ground shook as engines roared and artillery thundered across the frozen fields. Against them stood the exhausted men of the U.S. 3rd Infantry Division, stretched thin along a defensive line that was never meant to hold back a force this large. Among those American soldiers was a man who should not have been there at all. Garland Merle Connor was not in a trench or a foxhole. He was supposed to be miles away, recovering from a hip wound in a field hospital. He was small, underweight, and unimpressive by any standard measure of a soldier. Nothing about his appearance suggested he would soon decide the fate of an entire battlefield. But as the sound of German artillery echoed through the winter air, Connor understood something his body could not ignore. His unit was under attack. His brothers were about to be overrun. And the skills that might save them were not written in any army manual, but carved into him long before the war, learned in silence, in cold forests, where survival depended on not being seen, not being heard, and not even being noticed while breathing. Before the sun fully rose over the frozen fields of Alsace, Garland Connor left the hospital behind and headed back toward the sound of war, carrying with him nothing more than a field telephone, a spool of wire, and a lifetime of knowing how to disappear. When Garland Connor reached the American lines, the situation was already deteriorating. German artillery had torn gaps through the thin defensive positions, and forward units were reporting enemy infantry moving dangerously close. Command needed eyes beyond the front line, someone who could see the enemy's movements and guide artillery fire with precision. It was a job with an expected lifespan measured in minutes. A call went out for a volunteer to move forward and act as a forward observer. No one stepped forward at first. The open ground between the lines offered almost no cover, and German gunners were already ranging the area. Anyone who attempted the run would likely be spotted and cut down before reaching a usable position. Connor raised his hand. He did not argue. He did not explain. He simply accepted the equipment and prepared to go. In his hands were 3 simple tools: a field telephone, a Thompson submachine gun, and a spool of telephone wire. To the officers around him, the wire was for communication. To Connor, it was something else entirely. It was a trail no different from the subtle marks he had once used in the Kentucky forests to find his way home after hours of still hunting. As artillery shells burst around him, Connor sprinted forward across the frozen field, unspooling the wire as he ran. Snow exploded upward with every impact, chunks of frozen earth raining down around him. The wire stretched behind him, cutting a thin, invisible line through smoke, chaos, and whiteout conditions. Even if visibility vanished, even if landmarks disappeared, he would always know exactly where he was and how to get back. He reached a shallow irrigation ditch just beyond the American line. It was barely a foot deep, hardly enough to hide a man, let alone protect him from shrapnel. When Connor lay flat inside it, part of his body still remained exposed. To most soldiers, the position would have felt like a death sentence. To Connor, it was familiar. It felt like the places he had waited in as a boy, lying motionless for hours while wild turkeys passed close enough to touch. He connected the field telephone and spoke calmly into the receiver. He gave his position. He told command he was ready. The German advance continued. Infantry moved forward in disciplined formations, tanks looming behind them like iron shadows. Through the blowing snow, Connor watched without moving a muscle. His breathing slowed until it was barely perceptible. Every instinct drilled into him by years of hunting took over. Do not shift your weight, do not blink unnecessarily, do not react. When he spoke into the telephone, he did so in short, precise sentences, coordinates, distances, directions. Each whispered report was followed moments later by artillery impacts that ripped through German ranks. Explosions walked methodically across the frozen field, breaking formations, throwing men into the air, forcing the advance to slow. The Germans knew what was happening. They knew an observer was somewhere ahead of the American line. Patrols fanned out, scanning the ground, firing into suspicious depressions. Several passed dangerously close to Connor's position. At times, they were near enough that he could hear their boots crushing snow, hear officers shouting orders, hear men breathing in the cold air. Still, he did not move. Hour after hour, Connor remained in the ditch, feeding death through a telephone line while an entire German attack force searched for a man who, for all practical purposes, did not exist. By the third hour, the battlefield had closed in around Garland Connor. The open space that once separated him from the German advance no longer existed. What had begun as distant movement and muffled sound was now immediate and suffocating. German soldiers were no longer advancing in broad formations. They were everywhere, spreading out, probing, searching the ground with growing desperation. Connor's companion had already been wounded and forced to withdraw. The field around him was littered with shell craters, broken equipment, and bodies half buried in snow. Smoke hung low, trapped by the cold air, turning the battlefield into a gray, shifting maze. And in the middle of it all, Connor remained alone, pressed into a ditch barely deep enough to conceal his body. The Germans were close now, too close. Through the telephone, American artillery officers urged him to pull back. They could no longer safely fire at the advancing enemy without risking his life. The German infantry had moved inside the minimum safe distance. Any shell that landed now would not distinguish between friend and foe. Connor understood the situation instantly. He had spent his life judging distance, timing, and risk. He knew exactly how close the Germans were. He could hear them clearly, boots crunching through frozen snow, men coughing, weapons clinking against gear, officers issuing quiet, urgent commands. Some were so near that a single careless movement would give him away. He also understood what would happen if he withdrew. If the German force broke through this sector, the American line would collapse. Units would be isolated. Hundreds of men exhausted, under strength, and already worn down by weeks of fighting would be overrun before reinforcements could respond. The battlefield would turn into a slaughter, and there would be no second chance to stop it. Connor lay still, staring at the frozen earth inches from his face, and made his decision. When he spoke into the telephone again, his voice did not shake. He did not hesitate. He did not ask for permission. He ordered the artillery to fire directly on his position. On the other end of the line, there was silence. The request was unheard of. Artillery doctrine existed to support troops, not to erase them. The officer repeated the order back to him, certain there must be some mistake. Connor confirmed it. He was calm. He was certain. He understood the consequences. The artillery officer hesitated only for a moment longer. Then he gave the order. Shells screamed overhead, the sound rising from a distant whistle into a tearing roar. Connor pressed himself deeper into the ditch as the first explosion slammed into the ground around him. The earth convulsed. Snow, dirt, and steel fragments tore through the air. The shockwaves crushed against his body, ripping the breath from his lungs. German soldiers who moments earlier had been searching the field were caught in the open. Men were thrown from their feet. Bodies vanished into clouds of debris. Shrapnel scythed through ranks at point-blank range. The organized advance disintegrated into panic as survivors fled in every direction, desperate to escape the storm of steel falling from the sky. For long minutes, the barrage continued. The explosions were so close that survival seemed impossible. When the firing finally stopped, the field fell into an eerie silence broken only by distant shouts and the crackle of burning equipment. Then the telephone line crackled. Connor spoke again. He was alive, and the German attack was finished. When the artillery fire lifted, the battlefield looked nothing like it had an hour earlier. The frozen field was torn open, cratered, and blackened. Snow had been blasted away in wide circles, replaced by churned earth and shattered ice. Smoke drifted low across the ground, and the smell of explosives and burning metal hung heavy in the air. American soldiers waited in their positions, unsure of what they would find. No one knew whether Garland Connor had survived. The barrage had been so close, so intense, that many assumed the observer had been killed along with the enemy he had destroyed. Yet moments later, his voice came through the field, telephone steady, controlled, unmistakably alive. With the German assault broken, American units cautiously advanced. Patrols moved through the devastated ground, stepping carefully around unexploded ordnance and bodies half buried in the snow. What they found confirmed what Connor's calm report had already suggested. Dozens of German soldiers lay dead. Many more were wounded or had fled, abandoning weapons, equipment, and even armored vehicles in their retreat. The counterattack had not merely failed, it had collapsed completely. Near the center of the devastation, soldiers found the shallow irrigation ditch. It was barely 30 centimeters deep, offering almost no protection. Inside, it lay a field telephone, a Thompson submachine gun, and the faint imprint of a man who should not have survived. Shell craters surrounded the position, some so close that fragments of steel were embedded in the frozen walls of the ditch itself. The men who saw it struggled to understand how anyone could have remained alive there. Connor emerged from the position bruised, shaken, and exhausted, but uninjured. He did not celebrate. He did not speak about what he had done. To him, the outcome was simple. The line had held. His unit was alive. The hunt was over. The fighting did not stop there. In the days that followed, Connor continued to operate at the front, leading patrols and assaults with the same quiet determination. Less than 2 weeks later, during fierce urban combat, he personally killed multiple enemy soldiers and helped capture dozens more. Even after being wounded again, he refused evacuation until the mission was complete. By the end of the war, the record was staggering. 28 months of nearly continuous combat, 10 major campaigns across North Africa and Europe, 4 amphibious landings, 7 combat wounds, decorations stacked upon decorations, silver stars, bronze stars, purple hearts, marks of courage that barely hinted at the toll the fighting had taken on him. Yet when the war ended, Connor did not return home as a hero in his own eyes. He returned as a man who had done what was necessary and nothing more. He packed his medals into a duffel bag and put them away. He bought farmland in Kentucky, planted crops, and lived quietly among people who knew him only as a hard-working farmer. At night, however, the war did not stay buried. The memories followed him home, the explosions, the cold, the men who had passed within arm's reach without seeing him. Like so many others of his generation, he carried the war in silence, long before anyone had a name for what it had done to him. The battlefield in Alsace faded into history. The ditch filled with snow. The wire was rolled up. But the choice he made there, lying still while the world exploded around him, had already saved hundreds of lives, whether anyone remembered it or not. For Garland Merle Connor, the war did not end with parades or speeches. It ended quietly, the way his life had always been lived. When Europe fell silent and the guns finally stopped, he returned to Kentucky and disappeared back into the hills and farmland that had shaped him long before he ever wore a uniform. He planted tobacco, worked the soil, and lived among neighbors who saw only a modest farmer with a reserved manner and tired eyes. He never spoke about the frozen field in Alsace, not to his wife, not to his children, not even to other veterans. The medals he had earned, more than almost any other American soldier of the war, remained hidden at the bottom of a duffel bag. At night, he sometimes woke in terror, fleeing the house to sit alone on the porch, smoking in the darkness until the memories loosened their grip. There was no diagnosis, no counseling, no language for what haunted him. You survived, and you carried it alone. Years passed, decades passed. The world moved on. But one person never forgot. His wife, Pauline, knew the truth of what her husband had done, even if he refused to speak it aloud. After his death, she began a quiet campaign of her own. She gathered documents, tracked down eyewitness accounts, and wrote letter after letter to military boards and politicians. She refused to let his actions be reduced to a footnote or lost to time. The officers who had commanded Connor supported her efforts. They testified that his decision to call artillery on his own position had saved an entire battalion from destruction. They described him as the most outstanding soldier they had ever led. Still, recognition came slowly. Paperwork stalled. Years slipped by. Then, more than 7 decades after that frozen morning in January 1945, the truth finally caught up with history. In 2018, Garland Merle Connor was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. His widow, now in her 90s, stood in the White House and accepted it on his behalf. The medal rested heavy in her hands, a symbol not of glory, but of sacrifice long delayed. The nation finally acknowledged what one quiet man had done when everything depended on it. On that day, in Alsace, Connor did not think of medals, recognition, or legacy. He thought of the men behind him. He thought of the line that had to hold. He thought like a hunter, weighing risk against necessity, and he chose to stay still while the world burned. Hundreds of soldiers went home because of that choice. They married, they had children, they lived entire lives that would have ended in a frozen field if one man had not whispered coordinates into a telephone and accepted death without flinching. In the end, this is not a story about a trick, or a weapon, or even a war. It is the story of how skills learned in silence, patience, restraint, and the ability to disappear became the most powerful force on a battlefield, and how a farmer from Kentucky proved that sometimes the bravest act in war is not to advance, but to lie perfectly still and refuse to move, no matter what is coming. War stories often focus on speed, firepower, and aggression. They celebrate the charge, the breakthrough, the moment when overwhelming force smashes resistance. But the story of Garland Merle Connor teaches a different lesson, one that runs counter to nearly every instinct humans have under pressure. On January 24th, 1945, Connor did not win by advancing. He did not win by firing his weapon. He did not win by overpowering the enemy. He won by remaining still. And in doing so, he demonstrated principles about survival, leadership, fear, and responsibility that extend far beyond the battlefield. To most people, stillness looks like inaction. In combat, it looks like hesitation. In life, it is often mistaken for weakness. But Connor's stillness was not passive. It was deliberate, trained, and active in ways that mattered more than movement. As a child in Kentucky, hunting wild turkeys, Connor learned a brutal truth. Movement attracts attention, and attention invites death. Turkeys do not forgive mistakes. Neither does an enemy force advancing across open ground. Connor's stillness was not the absence of effort, it was effort refined to its most disciplined form. Every muscle held under control, every breath measured, every instinct to flinch, adjust, or react suppressed. This teaches a critical lesson. Not all action looks like motion. In modern life, we are taught that constant movement equals progress. We equate busyness with effectiveness. But many of the most decisive moments, whether in leadership, crisis, or personal struggle, require restraint rather than reaction. The ability to stay still when chaos demands movement is not weakness. It is mastery. No one watching Garland Connor lie in that ditch would have seen preparation. There was no checklist, no visible system, no formal training manual for what he was doing. But every second he survived was paid for years earlier. He paid for it as a boy learning to hunt because his family needed food. He paid for it in silence, cold, and hunger. He paid for it long before the war ever began. This is one of the hardest truths people struggle to accept. The moment of crisis only reveals preparation. It never creates it. When the German soldiers passed within meters of Connor, he did not suddenly become calm. He had already practiced calm for decades. When artillery thundered around him, he did not invent courage. He relied on habits formed long before courage was required. Most people wait until pressure arrives to ask who they are. By then, it is too late. The lesson is unforgiving but clear. You do not rise to the occasion. You fall back on what you have trained to be. The German attack force was larger, better equipped, and supported by tanks. On paper, it should have crushed the thin American line. But Connor did not attempt to match strength with strength. He turned the enemy's mass into a vulnerability. By remaining unseen and feeding precise coordinates, he transformed American artillery into a scalpel instead of a hammer. Each shell landed where it mattered most, not because of superior firepower, but because of superior information. This is a lesson repeated throughout history, but rarely learned. Raw power is only dangerous when it is properly directed. In business, politics, conflict, and life, people often believe they must become stronger to win. But Connor shows that positioning, awareness, and timing can neutralize overwhelming force. He did not defeat the German advance by being more aggressive. He defeated it by being more informed. Connor was not fearless in the way movies portray heroes. He did not lack fear. Fear was present. Fear of discovery. Fear of artillery. Fear of dying alone in frozen ground. What separated him from others was not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear dictate movement. His father taught him this distinction while hunting. Fearless does not mean without fear. It means acting correctly despite fear. This matters because most people wait for fear to disappear before acting. They tell themselves they will move when they feel confident, calm, or ready. But fear never disappears in moments that matter. The lesson is simple and brutal. Fear is not a signal to stop, it is a signal to focus. When artillery officers told Connor to withdraw, their logic was sound. He was too close. Continuing would likely kill him. But Connor understood something deeper. His survival was no longer the primary variable. If he pulled back, the German force would break through. Hundreds of men would die. Entire units would be wiped out. Responsibility reshapes risk. For someone acting only for themselves, withdrawal was rational. For someone acting for others, staying was necessary. This is the dividing line between individual bravery and true leadership. Leadership is not about courage in isolation. It is about absorbing risk so others do not have to. When Connor ordered artillery on his own position, he crossed that line completely. He accepted death not as a dramatic gesture, but as a logical outcome of responsibility. This teaches a lesson most people avoid. True responsibility often requires choosing outcomes you personally cannot survive. Connor's use of telephone wire was not just communication, it was navigation, orientation, and survival combined into one system. While others saw equipment, he saw structure. The wire anchored him in chaos. It gave him direction when smoke erased landmarks. It connected him to power far beyond his physical reach. This reflects a broader lesson. People who survive chaos build systems, not reliance on instinct alone. Instinct is unreliable under pressure. Systems endure. In life, those who plan for failure, who create redundancies, backups, and orientation, outlast those who rely on confidence alone. Connor survived artillery that should have killed him. He survived 7 wounds. He survived the war. But survival came at a cost. After the war, he did not celebrate. He did not display medals. He did not tell stories. He carried the war inward. This teaches an uncomfortable truth. Survival and wholeness are not the same thing. Many people assume that enduring hardship makes you stronger in obvious ways. Often, it makes you quieter, more reserved, and more private. The absence of visible scars does not mean the absence of damage. Connor returned home as one of the most decorated soldiers of World War II and lived unnoticed for decades. No paralyze, no recognition, no validation. It was not until 73 years later that his actions were formally acknowledged. This exposes a flaw in how societies measure value. We reward visibility more than impact. We celebrate noise over effectiveness. Connor's story reminds us that history is full of people who carried immense weight without applause. Connor did not seek recognition. He sought completion of duty. It was his widow who fought for his legacy, not him. This teaches a final lesson. Legacy is not built by chasing memory. It is built by acting correctly when no one is watching. Connor's greatest act occurred unseen, unheard, and almost unrecorded. Yet it reshaped lives far beyond that frozen field. In a world obsessed with speed, reaction, and visibility, Garland Merle Connor teaches a radical lesson. Sometimes the most powerful action is restraint. Sometimes the bravest choice is stillness. Sometimes survival depends not on doing more, but on doing less perfectly. He lay in a ditch while the world exploded. He whispered coordinates instead of shouting commands. He accepted death quietly so others could live loudly. And because of that, hundreds of men went home. That is the lesson of the man who didn't move. The story of Garland Merle Connor also forces us to confront an uncomfortable contradiction about how humans understand courage. We are conditioned to admire action that is visible, charging forward, standing tall, shouting orders, raising flags. Stillness rarely fits that image. Yet in reality, some of the most decisive forms of courage are invisible. They do not announce themselves. They do not look heroic in photographs. They often look like nothing at all. Connor's courage did not express itself through dramatic motion. It expressed itself through restraint so complete that it bordered on self-erasure. He reduced his physical presence to the absolute minimum required to remain alive. In doing so, he turned invisibility into a weapon. This challenges the common belief that courage must be loud, forceful, or confrontational. His example suggests the opposite. Courage can also be quiet, patient, and nearly indistinguishable from absence. There is a deeper psychological truth embedded here. Human beings are wired to respond to threats with movement. Fight or flight is not a metaphor, it is a biological reflex. Remaining still under mortal danger goes directly against instinct. Connor's ability to suppress that reflex was not superhuman. It was learned, and anything learned can, in principle, be taught, practiced, and refined. This reframes courage not as an innate trait possessed by a few, but as a discipline developed over time. Another lesson emerges when we examine how Connor perceived time. For most soldiers, time under fire collapses. Seconds feel endless. Minutes feel unbearable. Panic accelerates perception until judgment becomes unreliable. Connor, by contrast, expanded time. Hours passed while he lay motionless, yet his perception remained controlled. He did not rush decisions. He did not act prematurely. He allowed events to unfold until the precise moment intervention was necessary. This relationship with time is critical. In life, poor decisions often arise not from lack of information, but from impatience. People act because waiting feels intolerable. Connor waited because waiting was the point. He understood that endurance itself could shape outcomes. His patience was not passive delay, it was active resistance against panic. The telephone line running back to American position symbolized more than communication. It represented trust. Connor trusted that those on the other end would listen, calculate, and act responsibly. Likewise, artillery officers trusted the voice coming through the receiver enough to do the unthinkable and fire directly onto one of their own men. This mutual trust transformed individual sacrifice into collective survival. Trust, in this sense, becomes a force multiplier. Without it, Connor's actions would have been meaningless. His story reminds us that even the most extraordinary individual effort depends on systems of trust larger than oneself. Lone heroism without coordination rarely succeeds. Connor was effective precisely because he acted within a system that valued precision, communication, and restraint. Yet systems alone are insufficient without moral clarity. When Connor ordered artillery onto his own position, he crossed into a realm where regulations, protocols, and training could no longer provide guidance. The decision was ethical, not procedural. He weighed lives against lives and chose to absorb the cost himself. This moment illustrates a grim reality. In extreme circumstances, moral responsibility cannot be delegated upward or outward. It rests entirely on the individual willing to bear it. Such moments are rare, but their logic applies broadly. Leadership, at its core, is the willingness to accept consequences that others cannot or should not have to face. Titles, ranks, and authority mean little without that willingness. Connor had no obligation to sacrifice himself. He chose to because he understood that leadership sometimes demands irreversible commitment. After the war, the absence of recognition shaped Connor's remaining years. His silence was not modesty, it was containment. The world he returned to lacked the vocabulary to process what he had endured. Society moved forward quickly, eager to forget the cost of victory. He buried his medals because they represented memories that could not be integrated into ordinary life. This exposes a broader societal failure. We often celebrate acts of courage while neglecting the aftermath borne by those who perform them. Connor's nightmares, isolation, and emotional withdrawal were not personal weaknesses. They were predictable consequences of prolonged exposure to lethal responsibility. The absence of recognition compounded this burden, reinforcing the idea that some sacrifices are too inconvenient to remember. It was left to his widow to challenge that silence. Her persistence reveals another dimension of courage, one exercised not under fire, but over decades. She fought bureaucracy, indifference, and institutional inertia with nothing but documents, testimony, and refusal to give up. Her struggle reminds us that history does not preserve itself. Memory requires advocates. The delayed recognition of Connor's actions raises difficult questions about how societies define value. Why do some acts become legend while others fade? Why are loud narratives favored over quiet ones? The answer often lies not in importance, but in simplicity. Connor's story resists easy storytelling. It lacks spectacle. It lacks a clean emotional resolution. It is uncomfortable because it forces us to confront sacrifice without celebration. In the end, Garland Merle Connor's life offers a lesson that transcends war. It teaches that effectiveness is not always visible, that courage is not always dramatic, and that responsibility often demands choices that will never be fully understood by those who benefit from them. His greatest contribution occurred when no one was watching, when survival required the complete suppression of self. He did not conquer territory. He did not deliver speeches. He did not seek remembrance. He lay still, breathed slowly, and accepted death as a possibility without complaint. And because of that, others lived. That is the final lesson of his story. History is not shaped only by those who move forward loudly, but also by those who know when not to move at all. The longer one studies Garland Merle Connor's life, the clearer it becomes that his greatest battle did not end in Alsace. The frozen field was only the moment when everything converged. The real struggle unfolded afterward, quietly, invisibly, and without witnesses. It was the struggle of returning to a world that had no place for what he had become. War simplifies life in brutal ways. There is a clear enemy, there is a clear objective. Survival and duty compress morality into immediate choices. But peace is far more complicated. It offers no clear front lines, no measurable victories, no moments where sacrifice produces instant meaning. For men like Connor, this transition was not relief, it was disorientation. When he returned to Kentucky, the rhythms of civilian life continued as if uninterrupted. Crops still needed planting. Weather still dictated labor. Neighbors still talked about prices, land, and family. None of it acknowledged the fact that Connor had once lain beneath his own artillery fire to save hundreds of men. There was no framework to integrate such an experience into everyday conversation. Silence became the only viable option. This silence was not forgetfulness. It was containment. Connor understood that the language of war could not be translated without distortion. To speak would either trivialize what had happened or burden others with realities they could not process. In choosing silence, he protected those around him, even at the cost of isolating himself. This introduces a difficult lesson about moral asymmetry. Those who carry the greatest responsibility often carry it alone. The benefits of their actions disperse outward, while the psychological cost concentrates inward. Connor absorbed the weight so others did not have to. That pattern did not end. When the war ended, it followed him home. Another layer of meaning emerges when we consider how Connor perceived himself. Despite his decorations, he never internalized the identity of a hero. In his mind, he had simply done what the situation demanded. This distinction matters. When people see themselves as heroes, they expect recognition. When they see themselves as responsible actors, recognition becomes irrelevant. This mindset is rare and often misunderstood. Modern culture tends to frame extraordinary action as evidence of extraordinary identity. Connor rejected that framing entirely. His humility was not performative. It was structural. He did not separate himself from the men he saved. He did not see his life as more valuable than theirs. He viewed the decision in Alsace as an extension of obligation, not elevation. That perspective explains why medals meant so little to him. Medals symbolize acknowledgement from institutions. Connor's moral compass did not rely on institutions. It relied on internal coherence, on knowing that he had acted correctly when the cost was absolute. External validation could not add to that certainty, nor could its absence diminish it. This internal coherence is perhaps the most important lesson his story offers. In moments of extreme pressure, clarity does not come from ideology or abstract principles. It comes from alignment between values and action. Connor did not hesitate because he was already aligned. His life had prepared him not just with skills, but with priorities. He valued collective survival over personal preservation. He valued responsibility over recognition. He valued correctness over comfort. These values did not originate on the battlefield. They were forged in poverty, necessity, and quiet endurance long before the war. The Great Depression taught him scarcity. Hunting taught him patience. Family responsibility taught him self-suppression. War merely revealed what was already there. This challenges the notion that extreme circumstances create heroes. More often, they expose character that has been quietly accumulating all along. Crisis acts as a mirror, not a sculptor. Connor's reflection happened to be extraordinary, but it was not accidental. There is also a sobering lesson in how long it took for his actions to be formally recognized. 73 years passed before the Medal of Honor was awarded. Entire generations lived and died without knowing his name. This delay was not an anomaly. It was symptomatic of how institutions struggle to process acts that defy conventional narratives. Connor's decision to call artillery on himself did not fit easily into heroic archetypes. It was neither offensive victory nor dramatic sacrifice in the traditional sense. It was calculated self-erasure. Bureaucracies are uncomfortable with such acts because they resist replication. You cannot train doctrine around someone willing to die without protest. You cannot standardize moral absolutes. As a result, history often sidelines these stories, until individuals like Pauline Connor refuse to let them disappear. Her persistence represents another form of courage, one rooted not in physical danger, but in emotional endurance. She carried the story when her husband would not. She confronted institutions that prefer simplicity over complexity. In doing so, she demonstrated that remembrance itself can be an act of moral responsibility. Her struggle also reframes legacy as a shared endeavor. Connor's life alone might have remained anonymous. It required another person's commitment to memory for his actions to be fully acknowledged. This reminds us that no legacy exists in isolation. It depends on witnesses, advocates, and those willing to resist forgetfulness. There is a further, more uncomfortable implication. For every Garland Connor eventually recognized, there are countless others who never will be. History is not a complete record of merit. It is a selective narrative shaped by visibility, documentation, and persistence. Understanding this should humble us in how we judge the past and cautious in how we assign value. Returning again to that frozen ditch, one realizes that Connor's greatest act was not heroism as commonly defined, but constraint. He constrained movement, breath, fear, instinct, and self-interest. He narrowed himself until only purpose remained. In a world that encourages expansion, more expression, more assertion, more visibility, his life argues for the opposite under certain conditions. Constraint, when chosen deliberately, can be more powerful than freedom. Silence, when disciplined, can outweigh speech. Stillness, when intentional, can shape outcomes more decisively than motion. These are not comfortable lessons. They do not align with motivational slogans or popular narratives, but they are real. Connor's story ultimately asks a question that has no easy answer. What would you be willing to absorb so others do not have to? Most people never face that question in such stark terms. Yet smaller versions of it appear throughout life in leadership, parenting, moral decision-making, and personal sacrifice. The scale changes, but the principle remains. Would you accept invisibility so others can succeed? Would you endure discomfort so others can be safe? Would you remain silent when speaking would ease your own burden but harm collective stability? Garland Merle Connor answered those questions without rhetoric, without witnesses, and without expectation of reward. He answered them lying in frozen ground, listening to artillery descend, trusting that doing the right thing mattered, even if no one ever knew. That is why his story endures. Not because it is dramatic, not because it is triumphant, but because it is honest. It reveals a form of strength that does not seek affirmation, a form of courage that does not advertise itself, a form of leadership that accepts extinction as a possibility and responsibility as a certainty. In the end, Connor did not shape history through conquest or command. He shaped it through restraint. He proved that sometimes the most consequential human act is not to advance, not to retreat, but to hold one's place absolutely, physically, morally, and psychologically until the world breaks around it. And when the smoke cleared, when the field fell silent, when survival replaced chaos, he did not stand up to be seen. He simply made sure others could go home. That is the quiet, unforgiving, enduring lesson of Garland Merle Connor. What ultimately makes Garland Merle Connor's story endure is not the extremity of his action, but the clarity behind it. In moments when survival instincts dominate, clarity is rare. Panic narrows perception. Fear fragments judgment. Yet Connor's decision was not fragmented. It was precise. He did not act impulsively, nor did he surrender to despair. He assessed the situation with cold honesty and accepted the outcome that followed logically from his responsibility. This kind of clarity is deeply unsettling because it exposes how often human hesitation is not caused by uncertainty, but by attachment. Attachment to self-preservation. Attachment to recognition. Attachment to the hope that someone else will take the burden instead. Connor severed those attachments without ceremony, not because he lacked desire to live, but because he understood that desire could not be allowed to dictate the outcome. This is an uncomfortable lesson for modern audiences. We are taught to protect ourselves first, to establish boundaries, to prioritize personal well-being above all else. While these principles have value, Connor's life reminds us that there are moments when moral gravity overrides self-focus. There are situations where the cost of preservation is paid by others, whether acknowledged or not. In such moments, neutrality becomes a choice with consequences. Connor refused neutrality. He did not wait for orders that would absolve him of responsibility. He did not attempt to justify his survival at the expense of others. He recognized that some decisions cannot be outsourced. When he said, "Cover my position," He was not requesting permission. He was assuming ownership of the outcome. Ownership is a rare trait under pressure. Most people search for loopholes, delays, or shared accountability. Connor accepted singular accountability. If the artillery struck him, that outcome would belong to him alone. If the line held, the lives saved would belong to others. This asymmetry did not bother him. It defined his choice. There is also a deeper lesson in how Connor perceived value.